Excellent. Thank you very much. And so welcome to tonight's talk, The Heroic Journey of the Miller Lake Lamprey, A Call to Adventure. And as August mentioned, I am the statewide lamprey coordinator for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so if you have any interests or questions or comments about lampreys, I would be the person to contact. And here's my contact information. Also wanted to briefly mention that realizing that this talk is being recorded, if in this year 2021, if you're viewing this in the future, in say 2026 or later, some of this information will likely have changed, and I would encourage you to reach out to me for more up-to-date information at that time. Before I proceed, I want to give a shout out to all the folks from various agencies and independent contractors who have been integral in the work for Miller Lake Lamprey. Individuals are shown here, and those that have asterisks are ones that have been critical most recently. And in fact, here is the core team of the Miller Lake Lamprey Technical Management Team. Left to right, we have Ben Ramirez, Roger Smith, Bill Tinniswood, that's me, Terry Smith, Stuart Reed, and Olivia Reed. Before we go any further, and August kind of alluded to this, let's just get something right out of the way that lamprey tend to creep some people out. People think they look like aliens, they're weird. Oftentimes people aren't aware of lamprey. And if they are, they're aware of the Great Lakes sea lamprey and all the damage it has caused on commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes. Let me assure you that the native lampreys in Oregon are nothing like the invasive sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. They're native here, our lampreys are. They will not attach to you or attack you. There's no evidence of that. And in fact, if you have lampreys in your local watershed, that is a very good thing, as I will describe a little bit later on. And August unwittingly set this next slide up perfectly. I'm a Star Wars fan, and I'd like to show this picture because it gets a few laughs, and you see the similarities between the sci-fi henchmen in Star Wars and lamprey. And just like the Star Wars henchmen are myths, they're not real. It's always also a myth that, once again, that our native lampreys are bad. In fact, they are good.
Hey, Ben, if I could interrupt you for just a second. There's a
Sure.
Sharing button we're seeing. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as August mentioned, there's about 40 to 45 species of lampreys that occur around the world. And lampreys are very primitive. They have no bones in their bodies. A lot of people tend to confuse them with eels, but they are not true eels. They are very different from eels. Lampreys also have no jaws. And they've been around a really long time. They are one of our most ancient ancestors. They've been recognized in the fossil record as up to 400 million years ago. And those extinct lampreys are very similar in appearance to the lampreys that exist today. And so their body plan, their behavior, their physiology, they've been quite adaptive, but without having changed much, which is pretty unreal. And people are shocked to learn that lampreys have been around since way before the dinosaurs and before a lot of geological action has happened and way before humans came on the scene. So that's pretty humbling. In this time, they've changed very little, and they've survived through 4 global mass extinctions, which is a sobering realization when you realize that, given that, and over the last 100 years, our current lamprey species, both in Oregon and around the world, have been suffering from a number of limiting factors and threats, and their numbers have been going down. So that's quite concerning that the taxon can exist for millennia through mass extinctions, and now recently their numbers are going down. Now let's get into the species of lampreys that occur in Oregon. We have 10 species, or about a quarter of the species diversity in the world exists right here in Oregon. And I've got them lined up by body size here, and these represent a variety of life history strategies. everywhere from juveniles that don't feed to juveniles that do feed parasitically or predatorily. And so it's quite amazing, and there's quite a variation in size here. The 5 species I have asterisks next to are those species that my agency has came up with status assessments on. The other ones, we don't have enough data to do status assessments so far, but the 5 that exist here have conservation plans linked with them. And of these 5, would like to focus on the smallest parasitic landlocked lamprey in the world, the Miller Lake lamprey, clocking in at just about 6 inches or a little bit less, so quite small. So small, in fact, you can fit it in your hand. They're resident and parasitic, and they're pretty cool. Their current status is sensitive, so they're on the state sensitive species list, which also makes them an Oregon Conservation Strategy species. And they occur in the upper Klamath Basin, including Miller Lake, shown by this little green icon here for the lake and the small creek leading out of it. Also in the upper Williamson River and the upper Sycan River. But for today's talk, I'm going to focus pretty much just on Miller Lake itself, which is the type from which the type specimen was described to science. So Miller Lake drainage is quite small. The lake itself is a few acres. It's over 100 feet deep in some places. It's quite cold and very low productivity. And keep in mind, this I'll show this map in subsequent slides, but the flow goes from here this way. So this is downstream, this is upstream. So these are feeder tributaries into the lake. This is the exit tributary out of the lake, Miller Creek itself. It's quite a beautiful lake. It has mixed conifer forests. The climate is very dry and hot in the summer and wet and cold in the wintertime, and has primarily volcanic geology that was influenced heavily by the eruption of Mount Mazama about 6,600 years ago. And Mount Mazama is, when it erupted, is what created Crater Lake, not very far away. Here's another picture of Miller Lake, just a beautiful setting. And I'm going to set the stage here for the story I'm going to tell about the Miller Lake lamprey with a few details from the conservation plan on this species that my agency came out with in 2005. The key goal for that plan was that the desired status of this species was to be distributed widely throughout its historic range, with populations robust enough to withstand stochastic environmental events, and with both the populations and their habitats secure from human threats. Key limiting factors identified back in 2005 include unscreened irrigation water diversions that may entrain Miller Lake lamprey, disconnectivity of habitats for the species to carry out its life cycle, and dewatering. Now, this is a picture of Pacific lamprey larvae that have been dewatered. I don't have a picture of Miller Lake lamprey dewatered, so just being transparent with you, but this is a picture's worth 1,000 words. And when dewatering happens, if it happens rapidly, the larvae will exit the sediment oftentimes and dry out and die or be picked off by bird and mammal predators. So to address these limiting factors, conservation actions that have been identified include screening irrigation diversions, making sure we have enough water in stream, creating habitat connectivity and passage, not stocking hatchery trout into areas where Miller Lake lamprey occur, so therefore to prevent predation on them, and research. So Miller Lake lamprey no longer occur in Miller Lake. Well, that's not quite true, but I'll describe that later. So one focus recently has been trying to get them back into the lake where they used to spawn and feed. And this it consists of two actions. One is surveying for their distribution there on the right-hand side of your screen, and on the left, translocating lamprey from donor areas up into recipient or barren areas in the hope to get them to recolonize their old habitats and eventually the lake. Before I proceed, you're wondering what this Ghostbuster outfit is on the right, and that is what we call a backpack electroshocker. The anode and cathode in each of the biologist's hands there, and he can set the voltage and send out a electrical current into the water column that just irritates the lamprey. The larvae exist within the substrate of water bodies, and when you put in the right pulse frequency and voltage, it irritates them or tickles them and gets them to come up out of the substrate, and we can use that to detect presence absence. Pretty cool. So as I mentioned, the most recent goal has been to try to get them up into areas where they used to exist but no longer exist. And this has consisted over the last 10 years of trying to get them from lower Miller Creek, where many exist, upstream into the upper basin, including Upper Miller Creek, Miller Lake, and Evening Creek, and these other feeder tributaries as well. And here's a picture of Upper Miller Creek and Miller Lake in the background. So we're trying to get them back up into the upper basin. And just a little bit more to orient you here, Miller Lake is off Highway 97, just west of the town of Chemult. So let me set the stage a little bit further, because I'm going to tell a story, and I want to orient you what kind of story I'm trying to tell here with this heroic journey. We're all familiar with Odysseus and the Odyssey, Luke Skywalker and Star Wars, Harry Potter and his various adventures, and Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And you're wondering, why in the world is Ben bringing up these stories when he's talking about lamprey? Well, there's a reason. All of these stories have a story arc, and the arc is there's a supreme ordeal. Like in the case of Wizard of Oz, the house gets picked up in a cyclone out of Kansas and taken to Oz. There's unification and transformation, where the protagonist or the hero is presented with a number of trials, in this case, trying to form a team and get out of there, and at the same time, increase your brain power, your heart, your courage. And eventually to click your heels and go back home and use all these trials and tribulations to learn, if you were to encounter the yellow brick road again, what would you do differently, or how could things become better? And the protagonist or hero in this story, as you know by now, is the Miller Lake lamprey itself. In the first chapter is the supreme ordeal in the 1940s and 70s, when ignorant actions at the time, were taken to eradicate the species before biologists knew better. And at the time, we thought the species was extinct. Then there was a rebirth after trials and tribulations, of a kind of a phoenix coming out of the ashes, if you will, where some surveys led to the realization, that this species exists elsewhere beyond the Miller Lake Basin. In the road back, or the hero's return, where it's redescribed as science, and a number of management actions are taken to benefit the species. Which brings us to a call to adventure in the present time of finding some evidence of the species back in Miller Lake, but realizing there's more that needs to be done and there's more challenges. So this is the story arc that I'm going to paint the details on, starting with the supreme ordeal. But before I can do that, I need to provide a little bit more background in the form of a prologue about the biology of the species and how that led to the supreme ordeal. And it starts with the life cycle of this species. They're very cool. You go from spawning adults that produce larvae, and the adults have a fecundity of about 600 eggs, which seems like quite a bit for an animal that's 6 inches or less. And these eggs hatch in about a month, and the larvae will drift out into depositional areas in the streams, and maybe even Miller Lake itself in the past. And they would burrow into the sediment and filter feed with their mouths. They don't have, remember, they don't have jaws. They're blind at this point, and they just filter feed the algae and microbiota and bacteria and that kind of stuff. When they get the right internal physiological cues and external environmental cues, they will transform into juveniles. They have eyes and sharp teeth in their mouths that set them up beautifully for parasitizing other fish. It helps them get to their big size, relatively big for the species, before they spawn and die. So this is the life cycle. And these animals, lampreys, are very hard to study and track because currently there's no anatomical structure or means to reliably estimate their ages. They're very cryptic, they're photophobic, they don't like light, and so they're hard to track when we don't know their population structure. Nevertheless, the best information we have are some rough estimates of duration of age periods. So about 30 months or 2.5 years for the larval period, and about 6 months for the juvenile and adult period, with transformation occurring in the fall and feeding between the fall and summer, with the life history culminating in spawning and dying in the summertime. Starting with the larvae here, and this is a different species of lamprey shown here, but in very similar kind of behavior and physiology and body morphology. And so what these young of year lamprey do after hatching, drift downstream and set up shop in soft sediments of streams or lakes where they can orient with their mouths towards the surface and filter feed. When they transform into juveniles, I mentioned earlier, they develop eyes. You see here and here on either side of the head. We're looking from the belly up, so underneath the animal. And here is the mouth with the teeth used for parasitization. Now, Miller Lake lamprey, when they feed, they are both feeding on blood and tissue of hosts, and they can also scavenge on other lampreys, Miller Lake lamprey. Here's a picture of a brown trout that we found in the creek, and you can see the wounds from Miller Lake lamprey on it. And brown trout were introduced in the system many years ago. I mentioned that they can scavenge on themselves as well. Here are some other species that lamprey, juvenile lamprey, feed on, and this includes two chub in Miller Lake and speckled dace outside the basin in the upper Williamson. Tweed chub no longer exist in Miller Lake. Other species that Miller Lake lamprey parasitize are introduced non-native game fishes, including salmon, brook trout, brown trout, rainbow trout. And here's a picture that we found in Lower Miller Creek of a lamprey attached to a brook trout. And to make it easier for you to see, I've outlined the lamprey here and the trout here. And before we proceed, you might wonder why my agency is interested in conserving a species that to some human standards, we might think is kind of gross or weird or very vampiric. But this is, much of nature is quite weird, and I had a teacher used to say much of biology is gross. And there's a number of benefits that lamprey can provide that I will get into later. Here's the same lamprey and brook trout that we netted out from the previous picture, just so you can get an idea of what we're looking at here. That's quite a large juvenile feeding on this brook trout. When this animal matures, it'll actually shrink because, again, it doesn't have bony elements, and that energy will go into its gonads. And there's the wound once again. This sets up the supreme ordeal I talked about. So back in the mid-1900s, the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is the predecessor to my agency, was very interested and hyper-focused on game fishes. That things have changed, and that's not how we do operate anymore. But at that time, they were very interested in setting up a trout fishery in Miller Lake. And here they're setting a gill net to monitor those populations of introduced trout. And what they found at that time is when they get trout in the gill nets, lo and behold, there was a number of to them mysterious lamprey species attached. And there was evidence that the trout weren't taking off, and they blamed the lamprey for this. So this sets up the supreme ordeal in the 40s through the 70s, in which actions were taken to eradicate Miller Lake lamprey before biologists knew better. And there's some information that seems to suggest that during this time period, especially the 50s and 60s, simultaneously in a different system in the Great Lakes, we had sea lamprey, and that some of those biologists that were trying to get rid of sea lamprey in the Great Lakes may have been talking with biologists from the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission in the mid 1900s to try to inform them on how to get rid of our native lampreys. Pretty surprising. So what started to happen at this time was the commission set up logs, barriers with screens on them to prevent the lamprey from going into the tributaries to spawn. This started way back in the 1940s, 80 years ago. This was followed up in 1958 by adding a highly toxic pollutant, toxaphene, to the system to get rid of the tui chub and the lamprey in the hopes that they could reset the system and have more trout there in the future for a better fishery. So now you've got temporary barrier dams. Now you've got toxicant added to the system. And here's an old historic photograph of the biologist putting this highly toxic chemical, loading it up, getting ready to disperse it. And it's pretty amazing. Today, if this were to happen, they'd probably be in hazmat suits or have respirators on and everything else. But yeah, here they are wearing derby hats and not very well protected. Then in 1959, as if this wasn't enough, the commission erected a permanent barrier about 1.5 miles downstream from the outlet of the lake in Upper Miller Creek, shown there by the red bar. And here's an old historic photo showing biologists putting that barrier in place to prevent lamprey from getting back up into the lake. And here's a picture from about the 90s or the early 2000s of that barrier. Now, if this were Pacific lamprey, it might be hard for them, but occasionally they might be able to latch onto it and climb above it. And Pacific lamprey are unique in that regard. But the much smaller Miller Lake lamprey with the much smaller sucker discs would not be able to ascend something like this. After all this, the commission concluded that by 1959, that the species was extirpated. They were successful. And then the next part of the story was that Carl Bond from Oregon State University and his student Ting Khan described the species from preserved specimens after it was believed to be extinct. And that was realized at that time, like, oh, this isn't just some lamprey. This is a unique species that exists nowhere else in the world. And that brings us to the second chapter of this story, unification and transformation, where the tide starts to turn for the better when we realize more information about the species in the 1990s to 2000. So in the 1990s, Stuart Reed and others found the species Miller Lake lamprey in the Upper Williamson and the Upper Sican, which was really exciting information at the time, because remember, before the 1990s, we thought that the species only existed in Miller Lake drainage and had been extirpated. But this suggests that that's not the case. They're a little bit more widely distributed. Also in the 1990s, shown by the star down here, they found evidence of Miller Lake lamprey and Lower Miller Creek. So the more they're looking, the more they're finding these species. And they redescribed Miller Lake lamprey to science in 2000. This was Chris Lorian, Doug Markle, Stuart Reed, and Margaret Docker. This sets up the third chapter of the story, the road back or the hero's return, which has occurred over the last couple of decades. So from about 2004 onward, Stuart Reed and others, I didn't come on the scene until my job was created in 2016, continued to do backpack shocking electrosurveys. And here's that backpack shocker unit and the anode and cathode. And here are the netters netting up the lamprey they see as they exit the substrate. So these are baseline surveys in the Miller Lake Basin. And then in 2005, biologists removed that permanent barrier in Upper Miller Creek. So that goes away. And then also in 2005, Roger Smith led the creation of the Miller Lake Lamprey Conservation Plan that identified the limiting factors and conservation actions that I identified earlier in the talk. And then over the last decade, we have been translocating lamprey from lower in the system up into the upper system. So from lower Miller Creek up into upper Miller Creek, the lake itself, and some of the feeder tribs. And then from 2015 onward, we were finding with our backpack shocking surveys sporadic evidence of reproduction, which are very small specimens at various age or size classes that indicates that, yes, some reproduction is occurring in areas where we translocated lamprey to. So this was really exciting. And this leads us to the present time, the call to adventure. Are lamprey getting back into Miller Lake? Well, the answer is a little bit nuanced. And however, there is evidence that they are getting back into the lake. So over the last couple of years, we've been finding them off the mouth of Evening Creek, which is one of the translocation destinations, and into the upper part of the lake. So this past year, 2020, we found them as far as 450 feet off the mouth of that small feeder tributary, which is, to me, outside of the creek plume entering the lake and more evidence that they're getting into the lake. And now the question becomes, how long before they start to recolonize the whole lake? In the past, before they were eradicated from the lake, they used to spawn all around the shoreline and were readily found in just a few feet of water spawning or rearing, and they were very abundant. Clearly, that's not the case now, but this is some encouraging evidence that we are on our way, hopefully, towards that. And here's a picture of Stuart and Olivia Reed off the mouth of Evening Creek, shocking for and netting lamprey in that area. So here is the whole heroic journey of the Miller Lake lamprey. We thought they were gone. When there's evidence that they're more widely distributed, and then we're slowly getting them back up into the upper Miller Lake Basin. And this brings us to the call for adventure. What are we going to do with this information? We know that there's evidence of lamprey persisting in those areas where we're translocating them to. We have some evidence of reproduction, but we don't have the information yet that suggests that they're fully reestablished in the lake. And it might take a while, given that the system is such a cold water system and the species is so small. It might be that it just takes a while for them to take off again, if you will. So we're continuing to monitor the situation, but the metrics remain elusive. How do you monitor the population abundance for a species that you don't know the population structure of, including ages or reproduction times, other than some very rough estimates? So what we're trying to do is get at this by proxy. And again, this is the backpack electroshocking surveys to look at connectivity and distribution, but we're also entertaining other ideas to supplement these surveys. If you were interested in today's talk, you may also be interested in the 8-minute story on Oregon Field Guide. Season 32, Episode 3, starts at the 16-minute, 25-second mark. And they did a pretty good job, but a little disclaimer here. You can imagine, as somebody who is a geek about the species that they work on, me with lamprey, I thought OPB did a great job. I'm thankful for what they did. But there's a mention in there about lamprey sucking the insides of their hosts out, and that's not quite true, and the wording may shock some people. But lamprey don't do themselves a whole lot of favors for some people, given their mode of feeding. So it is kind of what it is. But the story's not quite done here. So I want to provide an epilogue of ecosystem benefits that lamprey can provide, whether it's Miller Lake lamprey and its distribution, or Pacific lamprey throughout Oregon, or other species of native lampreys. So I mentioned earlier, when larval lamprey settle out after hatching, they can reside for a number of years in the substrate. And I think of them as the aquatic earthworms of aquatic systems. They burrow into the substrate, and there's been laboratory studies that have looked at this and found that by virtue of this action, this bioengineering bioturbates that sediment and oxygenates it, which improves conditions for local flora and fauna and can help with biodiversity. Here are some larval lamprey filter feeding. These are their branchiopores or gill slits. There's their mouth. It looks like a pitcher plant, and they're filter feeding. And I don't know where this picture was taken. I inherited it. But each of these yellow arrows shows a particular larval lamprey. And these aren't Miller Lake lamprey. I don't know which of our species they are. They're impossible to identify with just their mouth structure and as larvae right here alone. But the purpose of this slide is that they can be quite abundant where they are found, and they, by virtue of their filter feeding, can clean out algae out of systems and recycle nutrients. And take those nutrients from low in the trophic structure and turn them into animal tissue that's available for predators. And here are some examples of brook and Pacific lamprey predators. And we don't have information for Miller Lake lamprey, but we can make some informed speculation on how important they might be to various other animals. So here, I think this was taken in the Eugene area. Here's a picture of a green heron eating a larval lamprey, probably a brook or Pacific lamprey. Here's a picture of a signal crayfish eating what I think is a brook lamprey. Here's a picture of a gardener snake eating a lamprey after dewatering in the Clackamas Basin. Here's a picture of a northern pike minnow with a Pacific lamprey adult hanging out of its mouth. Here's a picture of a California sea lion and a bald eagle fighting over a Pacific lamprey in the nearshore ocean. And finally, here's a picture of a gull taken from someplace in the Columbia River Basin, and it's just chock full of juvenile lamprey, probably Pacifics. So everywhere we look, there's a connection to other animals. And there's probably several reasons for this. And two of the important ones are that lamprey don't have bones, and their energy content can be many times higher than that of game fishes. Here's a picture of Pacific lamprey spawning. I don't have one of Miller Lake lamprey, but I want to show this picture to you for a couple of reasons. You recall Miller Lake lamprey are resident, so they are therefore are not anadromous. They don't go out to sea. However, for our other species like Western River lamprey and Pacific lamprey, which is shown here, spawning, they provide a source of marine-derived nutrients into watersheds, so it's very important. And all lamprey species, by virtue of their spawning and creating nests or redds in gravel and cobble substrate with some sand, studies have been done that show on other lamprey species that this action diversifies the microhabitats and creates a whole slew of microhabitats, which has been associated with increased abundance and diversity of aquatic insects that other species like salmon feed on. And then finally, here's a picture of a spawned out Pacific lamprey. I wish I had one of the Miller Lake lamprey. I don't, so I'm using this instead. And look at the periphyte and growth on it. Look at the caddisflies attached to it. So this epilogue I'm showing you here is examples of how Miller Lake lamprey may help the ecosystems in which they reside. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Wow.
Thank you, Ben. And everybody, let's go ahead and turn on your microphones and we can do a quick round of applause before going into questions.